So, good morning, Nick. We are very happy to have you here. And this is a part of a project called Oral History of Tibetan Studies. And we are tracing the people as well as the discipline by oral memories or by memories of people associated with it. And as you have been already interviewed by Professor McFarlane in Cambridge and Mark Turin, we know quite a lot about your life. And there has been also some material published. So, building on that, we would like to ask you for more personal memories. And we would like to begin with your childhood. We know that you had two siblings, two brothers. And we would like to ask you which hobbies did you have as a child and what kind of child you were, probably. If you were a naughty boy or you liked studying from the beginning, or also about your trips to mountains.
Okay. Hobbies. Yes, I was a keen stamp collector and inherited or was given a large collection by an aged uncle, great uncle in fact, who had travelled himself as a sailor quite widely. So I think my sort of sense of geography of the world was surely stimulated by that. As to what sort of a child I was, well, yes, I was always studious, I'm sure. But in my relations with especially my immediately younger brother, I think I was rather shrewd and calculating and not very nice. I was quite adept at manipulating things so that he was in the wrong and I was in the right. And I regret that. And I mean, I think we enjoyed good relations as adults. But I've never quite forgiven myself for not being a nice elder brother. What else? Yes, well, I obviously enjoyed reading a great deal. But the physical side of life I also enjoyed. When we were in Hong Kong, I particularly enjoyed bathing in the sea. My mother was sort of keen and active. She was a great tennis player as well as a climber. And while we were there, I loved the trips to Deepwater Bay and Great Wave Bay, and our expeditions into the mountains at the north of the New Territories. So already I was sort of, I hope, combining academic intellectual interests on the one hand with physical ones on the other.
And you also mentioned that your family did hiking trips or climbing trips within Europe as well?
Yes. I said my mother was a keen climber. She'd done a lot of alpinism in Germany in the 1930s. And when she was in England, she joined, I think it was the Midland Association of Mountaineers, and we had 3, I think, summer holidays as a family, well, as the 3 sons, plus her. My father wasn't very happy in that sort of environment, in North Wales, in the under Mount Tryfan, and we used to occasionally be allowed to put on ropes and climbed on the milestone buttress on Tryfan, and I suspect in the Ogwen Valley, but I can't be sure of that now.
Why did you find the mountains so interesting?
Well, I think there was always, as there was for my mother, an aesthetic aspect, and that combined the aesthetics of the scenery, the environment, with the aesthetics of what you might call a sort of ballet. I always felt that climbing was partly an aesthetic undertaking with balance and elegance in principle, however much one struggled in practice. It should be, one should do it with ease and float up the cliff. So I think there were those two aspects.
And did you pursue this interest throughout your whole life?
No, I forgot about it in my late teens and early undergraduate career when I went in for international work camps. I did a lot of these, Jugendgemeinschaft Dienstelager, they were called, or the first one was called. So I did a couple in Germany, one in Spain, one in Italy, one in the Hebrides, and one in Greece. And this gave me a sort of feeling of being a European, which I never lost. But for some reason, I didn't make arrangements to climb on my own account until I think the third year as an undergraduate, when I did join the University Mountaineering Club and began climbing with them quite a lot. And I continued it all through medical school. And to some extent, even thereafter, when I was an academic, I did a little, but it tailed off as academic commitments and family commitments grew larger. But we still, I still take my grandchildren up to Wales. I'm still a member of the Climbers Club, so that I have rights to use accommodation in North Wales for quite a moderate price. So that side of my interest is still there.
You were also a member of a Scouts group?
Yes, that would have been at my prep school, so when I was 11, 12, 13. And yes, I loved that, especially climbing trees. And I can still remember in my mind some of the difficult feats one could do at that school. There was one called Jarvis's Crossing from one tree to another, where the unfortunate Jarvis, I've no idea who he was, fell off the tree and broke his arm. Yes, so I enjoyed that and the sort of communal life of camping, yes. But it didn't continue at public school at all, where I mostly played squash and tennis and that sort of thing.
How has been your relationship to Europe building at the time? So it seems that your mother tried to educate you or all her 3 children in different European languages?
Yes, she would occasionally break into German or French because it just came to her mind. She'd spent these exciting years for her. I've read her diaries recently, and she really loathed England life at her school in Folkestone, and adored life in France and Germany in the mid-30s until the rise of Hitler really disturbed and upset her. But she encouraged us, and it was sort of taken for granted that one would read French books from time to time, and indeed one of my brothers, the middle one, married a French girl, settled eventually in French-speaking Switzerland, and the other one settled in Luxembourg eventually, and has daughters high in the Luxembourg civil service. So we've always sort of felt European, which of course has implications for current political feelings and attitudes.
And then this relationship continued in your adulthood as well? So you went to these camps and then you trained or practiced as a doctor?
Yes, I took advantage of the opportunities as a clinical student and went for 1 month as an exchange student to Spain and another month as an exchange student in Greece, both of which were tremendous fun.
Which memories do you have of these 2 trips?
Well, they were usually, though one of them, in fact, in France, was working in slum, renovating old people's homes in slums. But usually they were outdoor activities, very physical, perhaps building a road to an isolated community for which the government, federal government, couldn't supply sufficient funds, and called on the voluntary sector, that sort of thing. And this was all good for fitness. And for an interest in languages. I met a lot of inspiring people at that time. I didn't keep up with them, but I just felt sort of close to Europe. And then fairly soon, when I became a Himalayanist, I found myself meeting a lot of French, particularly French and German Himalayanists of that period. And so it was really useful, having spent time on the languages. People like the MacDonalds, Sandy, and also Ariane, the wife, for a while, and various of the French anthropologists of that period I knew quite well. And also in Germany particularly, Michael Aris, usually called Mark, who was very friendly, and I found his book on the social organization of the Sherpas extremely useful and stimulating, and in some senses it really lies behind a lot of my later work. He was interested in the history of the Sherpas. He knew, I think, quite a bit of Tibetan and had done field work with the Sherpas. And he talked in particular about their 4 proto-clans. And I'd noticed in my reading about the Himalayas that several other groups had 4 proto-clans. They say that originally their society just consisted of 4 of them, so that one thinks of, for instance, the Gurung Charjat, or the Tamang equivalent. And I found traces of this same belief among the Tulung. So I mightn't have been attuned to the significance of this if I hadn't read Opitz's book, which was one of the few I actually took with me to Nepal, if I remember rightly.
And if we go back a bit still, could you tell us a bit more about your stay in Hong Kong? It was 47 until 49.
Yes, well, it was, in a way, I'm glad to have had it as an experience of the Raj, really. I mean, we didn't mix with Chinese people socially. My mother's, I'm sure, tennis partners would all have been English-speaking Brits, I think. I did go to a school where there must have been some Chinese, but I don't remember getting to know them at all. It wasn't that there was any sort of deliberate apartheid, but it was just the way things were. We did have 3 armors who worked in the house. There was one for cooking, one for looking after us, and one for looking after the garden. So, I mean, we had contacts with Chinese, but they were definitely servants. And so when I sort of read about the history of India, I can think back quite easily to the atmosphere of belonging to the Raj, with or without approval, as the case may be. I didn't really appreciate, I think, the alien culture of China. I mean, I must have been aware of odd smells and bells and temples, but I don't think it impinged very deeply. I don't remember showing any particular curiosity at that time or desire to learn more about China or Chinese. My father, however, did try and study a bit of Cantonese, so perhaps it sort of contributed to anthropological curiosity in that way.
And then you returned back to Europe. You were, I think, about 10 years old.
Yes.
And you went to school here again. And how were your hobbies developing at the time?
The one I remember best was actually wrestling. I think boys at that age do rather like wrestling, and that was the one, apart from tree climbing, that I enjoyed most. I did become, I think, captain of some football team, but team sports was never really my thing, and I always preferred more individual activities like tennis. As for what I learnt, well, I can't remember if I'd started Latin before. I probably had, because of the sort of atmosphere in education in those days, but if I hadn't done it before, I started straight away at the prep school, and a year or two later started Greek too. And I remember positively enjoying these languages, and I remember the headmaster who used to look into the dormitories to say good night and lights out. He once found me reading ahead in a Greek grammar, and he said, "Oh, don't do that last thing at night." So I didn't, but it shows that I was sort of genuinely fond of languages. And I must have got a good grounding in them, because I got some sort of scholarship to rugby in classics, which was a forerunner of scholarship in classics to New College much later. Yeah, so prep school was a reasonably contented period of my life, but public school was very different, and I didn't enjoy the society of my house, which is the domestic setting for a public school boy's life, and that is where you ate 3 times a day, and where you did your homework, and where you had a little study. I didn't really enjoy this very much, because I found few congenial friends. One that it joined me in playing fives and squash, and once in a naughty nighttime expedition to climb on the school chapel in the dark. But what I really enjoyed was the work in the form in the classroom. As I probably said in that autobiographical article, it was amazing how intensive the study of classics was, and how totally neglected more or less everything else was, so that I could well have passed the whole of my school days having done 1 term on the lower forms of pond life and nothing whatever on physics, chemistry, biology, otherwise astonishingly narrow. And I think that was one of the motives that made me change to medicine.
But you also had interest in art and music?
That was much fostered by the form master, because when you reached the top form working for Oxbridge scholarships, you tended to stay a long time there. I think I had 7 terms with him. And he gave individual tutorials, and usually started them with encouragement to look at Renaissance art. And he took a group of 5 of us to Italy, and after which 4 of them returned home and I hitchhiked. I was only 16 at the time, and nowadays it would probably be thought unduly risky or something, but I had a great time staying in youth hostels and trying to learn some Italian, which incidentally my father had spoken quite fluently. He spent a postgraduate year at the British School at Rome.
So that would have been the year 1954, if you were 16.
Yes, I should think it was.
And how was the hitchhiking?
Oh, that was great. In hitchhiking you take the rough with the smooth, and sometimes you stand by the wayside on the outskirts, the ugly outskirts of towns for a long time in heat or cold, whatever it may be. But on the whole, I did pretty well and got where I wanted to, and enjoyed being in the youth hostels. I remember my first trip to Ravenna, to the mosaics there, which we revisited last year, my wife and I. She hadn't ever been, and but I could still recall that trip. And I had a good time, really. But I spent a lot of time, even then, in galleries, and I really did love several of the Renaissance painters. My favourites varied over the years. Sometimes it was Piero della Francesca, sometimes it was Tintoretto, sometimes it was one of the Spanish masters of that time. So I didn't have a fixed repertoire, as it were. I enjoyed painting in general. Less the more modern painters, though of course one can't help enjoying Impressionists. My classics form master also spent a few days with me once doing watercolours in a caravan which we had near Hastings. He was an amateur sketch watercolourist, in the way that I think quite a lot of people were from his generation. I've got various books at home of watercolour sketches, some of India, from long deceased relatives. But I gave up trying to produce art myself long ago. As for music, I learnt the clarinet for many years, but it was partly a device to get out of corps. We had a military training unit at rugby school, and quite a lot of rugbyians did join the army in the 50s. And I wasn't really interested in that sort of activity, and at least if you could play a bit on the clarinet, you could join the band and be excused some drill. But I decided eventually that I didn't actually really like the physical activity of playing the clarinet. It's a pity. I rather wish I'd kept it up. But I did join at Oxford a recorder group, and later I took up the Spanish guitar for 6 months or a year of lessons. But for a long time I haven't tried to play music, though I encourage it in my offspring or descendants.
Do you still have some of your watercolors?
Yes, I do. They're hidden somewhere at home, but I know where to find them. They're not good.
Which themes did you prefer to depict?
Oh, they were outdoor scenery with perhaps a cottage or a cathedral in the background. very unoriginal. Perhaps a touch of Constable somewhere in the background, or Cotman, or one of those sort of English watercolorists.
And then you enrolled as a medicine student at Oxford?
Yes, that's right. I had 2 terms of intensive science at school in the same form as my fags. Senior boys in a public school had then, may still have, junior boys to help them as servants and be treated as lowest of the low. But I enjoyed that and found it very exciting, and then I had a bit more catching up in my first term at Oxford, but thereafter I was just treated as an ordinary medical student and began cutting up the arm of some deceased individual in the anatomy school. We recently had, a week or 2 ago, a talk by an anthropologist who was studying anatomy schools in general, and it was fascinating to be taken back 45 or more years to cutting up humans just a few yards away from where I heard the talk. Medicine, yes, and I enjoyed it to some extent, but I think what I liked most was, of what I read anyway, were the historical introductions to chapters in my big fat textbook on physiology. And that was really fascinating to me. Somehow, I mean, I was capable of learning all this stuff about physiology and anatomy, but I didn't particularly like anything except work on the brain and the nervous system, and that did interest me, and I was lucky enough to slip in a year of research in neurophysiology, which helped me realize that although I was interested in the outcome and the results of neurophysiology, I didn't like doing experiments, anything to avoid actually doing things with my hands in the lab. So although I got a BSc out of that year, it showed me some of my limitations. Another thing I really enjoyed as a student was one or 2 of the friends I made in New College. There was one who started cutting up the same arm as myself, but then his curiosity branched out and he ended up in PPP doing philosophy and psychology and physiology. And he was a fascinating man who broadened my mind quite a lot. And although I've never done any philosophy, insofar as I have philosophic curiosity, it largely is due to John Dorling, this fellow student at New College, who eventually taught philosophy of science in Holland, I think, also perhaps in London. But we have met occasionally at Gordy's, but I haven't kept in touch with him.
Has this training and practice influenced your later work?
Surprisingly little, really, as far as I can make out, but there are ways in which it surely contributed. It meant that when I became paid as a social scientist, I was aware of the hard sciences, and they were sort of always present in my mind, and it wasn't as though they were unknown territory, and the attitudes towards evidence of real hard scientists. So I think there's a sort of general background of influence from that period of my life. And it probably shows in a distrust of extreme relativism that some postmodernists went in for. that anything goes, that different cultures have different views of the world and they're all equally true. No, they're not all equally true. It would be perhaps nice for anthropologists if they were, but they're not. You've got to be realistic. So that contributed. I did take various medicines with me to do field work in Nepal, but they weren't much use because I had no pathology laboratory access, so I didn't know how to make diagnoses by myself on the whole, and there were no sort of nurses to help, as junior doctors are helped by nurses. Although I could occasionally distribute the odd pill, I suspect that, as so often, if the pill works, people give up taking them very quickly, and so they don't have a full course, and so their malady may recur. So I didn't achieve a great reputation as a curer, and I remember completely failing on the little pigs. My landlord had a pigsty, and the sow gave birth to piglets.
It was among the rye.
Among the rye I'm talking about now. And they all began dying, and I was asked to help, but I couldn't do anything there. And I was also asked by my landlord's wife to help her by extracting a painful tooth. And of course I got no training in dentistry, and I failed to pull it out. I merely inflicted pain on the poor woman. So it wasn't much use in the field, to be honest. I did write a paper on attitudes to illness among the Tulung, and it surely contributed to that, but only in a very general sense, not in any very precise way. So, how else? Well, I think it's given me more sympathy with biological anthropology than some social anthropologists have or had in those days. My supervisor, Rodney Needham, wasn't seriously interested in biological anthropology at all. He said he never encouraged us to read anything in it or go to any lectures in it, nor incidentally in Pitt Rivers or material culture. He was social anthropology, and that was it. Though he had wide interests outside anthropology, I shouldn't underplay those. But I was always interested in the primate background of humans, and I think this fed into my interest in kinship theory eventually, not straight away, where I started being interested solely in the linguistics of kinship terminologies, because I was interested in comparing kinship terminologies in different Tibeto-Burman languages. But eventually I became interested in the wider issues of kinship theory, what sort of thing kinship was. And I devised this scheme for or a theory really, of what is the simplest humanoid form of a kinship system which would organize society in a way that looked human. And in fact, you only need 4 kinship terms which cover the whole of society. And I still believe this theory, but it has not really yet caught on, I think, widely, and a lot of anthropologists have given up on kinship, and their teachers have too. But it'll come back, I think, and every now and then one sees signs of this, and I think tetradic theory, as I called my theory, is making its way gradually into encyclopedias and anthropological encyclopedias. But there's a good deal of cultural lag in anthropology, as in any discipline. People go on teaching what they were taught. And although we're all supposed to be really excited by new ideas, I'm not sure, quite how many anthropologists really are excited by new ideas, or if so, the ideas are new only in marginal respects rather than being deeply new. But that's one of my sort of vague grouses with anthropology.
And then, sorry, in 65, when I think you were 26 years old, you decided to switch to anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what influenced that change, and how did you come across anthropology as a discipline?
Well, I think there were an awful lot of factors, often negative ones, things I didn't like about possible medical futures. I wasn't really interested in therapy. I liked meeting students because it was a sort of humane activity, interviewing patients and so on. But I didn't have a vocation to cure people. And when I thought of academic or research aspects of medicine, none of them really attracted me. The experience of doing neurophysiology work showed that I wasn't really cut out for it. It was too narrow, too technical. I didn't have the maths. I didn't really like doing experiments. And there were so many things I really did like doing, which wouldn't really fit very easily into a medical career. This interest in languages, especially European, but not only European, even at that time, was one thing that I sort of felt, well, if I become a doctor, what good is it going to be to me to be interested in and to have invested a good deal of time in learning French, German, Italian, and so on. So there were those sort of questions, and there was the sort of feeling that one knew that any sort of research was a bit of a gamble. You might discover something really interesting, or you might not. You might just have an ordinary routine career and end up sort of retiring after a moderately successful career, but you hadn't really discovered anything. And I felt that the salvage aspect of anthropology offered a way of doing something that was definitive and nobody else was going to do, and really would give one a sense of having done something valuable and definitive. So I was attracted by various aspects of anthropology, the languages, the history, the potential for travel, for interest in wider fields than medicine would probably allow. So there were push factors and pull factors involved. And I think I mentioned the book, the first anthropology book I read, which happened to be a rather undistinguished textbook by Haddon, which I don't suppose anyone much reads nowadays, but it just opened my eyes to another possible career. I was thinking about all sorts of things. Could I have an interesting career in psychology, for instance? I read Piaget.
So Nick, you got interested in anthropology, and was there something else what you found so appealing about the discipline? Maybe you were, or I feel that you might have been looking for seeing the human's condition from another perspective. You already knew the physical one as a doctor. And you were also combining humanities, which you knew so well from your early schooling. Then you had sciences, and you just were beginning to cover social sciences as well.
Yes.
It was a very polyhistoric approach to education.
Well, it's looking back, it seems to me a little self-indulgent, almost selfish. But yeah, I loved learning things and saw this as a sort of new field that would be exciting. And it proved to be so. That first year introduction to anthropology that was on offer was indeed extremely exciting, as well as socially stimulating.
And at that time, among students, was it common to switch fields of studies?
Well, there were at least two social anthropologists around Oxford at that time who had medical qualifications. Colin Wilson Pepper, but I've forgotten the name of the second, but there was another one too, who worked in medical administration, I think particularly sort of public health, that sort of area.
And how was Oxford as a place to study in the 50s and 60s?
Of course, in the 50s, it was very old-fashioned and a bit like public school. Girls kept at a distance, that is, segregated in colleges. One didn't go into very much, not allowed in one's room after 8 o'clock. The sort of very boyish attitude. Of course, New College was rather full of Wickhamists, not only, but there are a lot of Wickhamists there, people from Winchester. I tended there too, as an undergraduate, to spread my interests rather widely. I think I joined about a dozen different clubs at different times. I don't know, film clubs, sports clubs, interests of one sort or another. I once joined a Russian choir at a time when I was trying to acquire some Russian. So there were a lot of different activities I went in for, but I didn't ever take politics very seriously. I don't remember if I ever joined for one term a political club, and I'm not sure which one it would have been if I had at that time. I had very little knowledge of politics indeed. I think I was quite a shy undergraduate, really, and although I had a few good friends, quite a lot of the contemporaries were people had done national service and were much more mature and much more experienced than I was as a young 18-year-old. So I probably didn't make as much as I might have of Oxford. I was never interested in debating, never joined the union, I think, though occasionally went to public events there. Don't think I ever acted at Oxford as I had at school and did later at medical school. As far as I can remember, I never got involved in the theatre. So there are a lot of things I didn't do. The medical teaching was a bit uninspired, to be honest. There was a nice man, but just not very inspiring, close to retirement, who gave me most of my tutorials at New College. And he did once ask me something interesting about was it Galileo or someone's theory of vision, and that was interesting. It involved looking at a Latin text, but by and large I just did a conscientious job for him, and only when he died in the third year of my course did I have a really exciting teacher whose name now escapes me, but who set, for instance, essays such as, what do you think would be the difference between an individual being with 2 legs, 4 legs, and 120 legs? And that was the sort of stimulus that he offered, and he was really good value. So I did meet exciting teachers, but not very many in that part of the course. And when I did the BSc, I had I had quite an exciting teacher called John Nichols, who read French novels and encouraged me to do likewise. He was quite interesting too. But I don't remember, being inspired by any of them and thinking, oh, that's exactly the career I'd like to imitate. That's just what I want to be like.
How did the atmosphere at university change in the 60s?
Well, it changed a lot for me because women had crossed my horizon at last, and I went to Linacre, which was, of course, a graduate college with plenty of women. I don't know if they were 50-50, but anyway, there were certainly plenty of them around. And I began to have girlfriends, and so it was a very different experience for me. And I'm so glad that the moral tutor I had at New College, a classicist who gave me the odd sherry from time to time, as moral tutors do, and probably did and probably still do for all I know, he had told me, don't come back to New College as a graduate, go to one of the new colleges, really new colleges, and I went to Linacre. So yes, it was more relaxed. I don't think I really participated much in the sort of swinging aspect of the 60s. That wasn't really quite my style. And I remember very late in the day hearing of the Beatles from David Pocock, who was one of our teachers in the Anthropology Institute, and I don't think I'd ever heard of them even. I was completely out of touch with that side of 60s life. What I remember most for changes of attitude was coming back from 2 years abroad for my fieldwork and being aware both of the environment, environmental green awareness, and feminism, neither of which had really impinged on me much before. But we're talking there in 1972. Yes, so you ask what changes I felt as a graduate. Well, it was really the sense of feeling that I was really doing the right thing. This anthropology was really exciting and offered real scope for all sorts of adventures, both in ideas and in terms of physical travel. So it was a happy period.
And within anthropology, you said that you began to focus on Nepal and the Himalayas because of your interest in climbing and mountains. But were there some other influences, perhaps? And was the choice not that random, as you
well,
said?
The interest in mountains was certainly there because I just read a book by an Italian mountaineer about the Himalayas or the Hindu Kush, which was fairly fresh in my mind. And when asked, do you have regional interests, it came to mind. But there were other deeper incentives. My mother, at the age of 4 months, was taken out to Quetta on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and she had memories of India from her earliest childhood. And further back in the family history, there were lots of relatives who had been in India for one reason or another, sometimes as missionaries, often as soldiers. My grandfather was a soldier, Bengal Lancers, and sometimes even as tea planters. There was one in Sri Lanka as a tea planter. So one in journalism. There was quite a strong sort of feeling on my mother's side of the family that India was interesting and not that far away. Less on my father's side. He had no clear interests in India at that time.
And you were quite self-confident in thinking that you choose a certain culture to study and you would like the culture once you go into the field.
Yes, well, Needham had been a Gurkha, and he sort of made nice noises about the Nepalese hill people. So I had that sort of encouragement. I was also well aware that I didn't want to specialize in an area that lacked a classical language. And although I didn't obviously know anything about Sanskrit, I knew that it was there, and that if you studied India, you might well find your way into Sanskrit as a tool or as a way of expanding your understanding of the subcontinent. And that certainly was an attraction. I'd read a little bit of general linguistics, books on semantics, books on comparative linguistics, and so I was certainly aware of the Sanskritic heritage, even though I knew very little about it at that time. So yes, there were family reasons as well as climbing reasons, as well as intellectual reasons.
While you were reading on Nepal and preparing for your trip, who were the influential authors and works? You have mentioned OHTS.
Yes. Well, my francophone interests meant that I quickly read the Pignèd's book on the Gurung. But very soon, too, I read Sylvain Lévy, and that certainly attracted me a lot. Sylvain Lévy was a marvelous Orientalist who knew masses of Oriental languages, but essentially a Sanskritist. And he was a bit of an inspiration. He wrote a 2-volume book, I think, on Nepal, having spent time in the Central Valley, and that was really quite inspiring. And I found the work of Sandy MacDonald, I think he'd already begun publishing, very interesting on, for instance, shamanism. And he always had a sense of the philological, literary aspect of studying in the Himalayas, unlike Fürer-Haimendorf, for instance, who was a serious and dedicated field worker, though not, I think, by this stage of his life, at any rate, much of a linguist. And I remember, was it then or a little later, being interested in the exchange between Snellgrove, the Tibetologist, and Fürer-Haimendorf. Fürer-Haimendorf wrote a book on the Sherpas, quite useful, but Snellgrove, rightly as I came to feel, said, well, really, you shouldn't study the Sherpas without knowing Tibetan. And so I was a bit torn between the philological and the anthropological, but I always felt strong sympathy for the philological. Though I didn't have many dealings with Snellgrove, I did, however, contact him about perhaps about 10 years ago, when he was long retired and had gone through all sorts of activities, such as advising the Pope on Buddhism, to ask if I could use a black and white diagram of the Bhava Chakra, which he had included in one of his books, and I wanted to write about that. And he happily gave me permission, and that was very useful to me, and formed the basis of one of the papers I most enjoyed writing, actually. So you asked, yes, about inspiring figures. Of course, I gained a lot from Dumont, whom I used for teaching, but of course the teaching came a good deal later, teaching Dumont. But I'd met him in the 60s, probably in Paris, possibly through Gaboriau, who wrote on Muslims in Nepal. And he was one of the various French people I was in touch with. And he later was always very friendly to me, because he'd had the position in the lectureship, which I had later. But that, again, is much later on. Other people I really enjoyed reading in my preparation for fieldwork. Well, of course, there were already Americans like Hitchcock writing, but not particularly inspiringly, I think. Sagan I enjoyed, who wrote on the Limbu. There were people like, I think Nebesky Wojtkiewicz I'd have probably only known later. Yes, I can't really remember any other inspiring figures. I read quite a lot of Fürer-Haimendorf, and was grateful to him for getting funding for my fieldwork, but I never sort of quite felt very close to him, partly perhaps because I was sort of based in Oxford and not in London, though I used to go up to London in preparation for fieldwork to study Nepali. I did 2 terms of Nepali at SOAS, going once a week during term time, where I met people like Pat Kaplan, Lionel Kaplan, and Alan McFarlane.
How did the course in Nepali look like? Did you have a textbook?
I used Clark's book, and I don't think we had auditory aids in those days. I don't remember playing tapes of Nepali, as I later played tapes of Hindi to improve my knowledge of the language. No, I think what oral training we had was actually from the Nepali who actually delivered Clark's course. It wasn't Clark who taught it any longer.
And Fürer-Haimendorf was your supervisor, was he?
Well, it was curious. At that time, it was possible to be registered for 2 doctoral degrees, and I registered for a SOAS doctoral degree, but I expect Needham encouraged me to register for an Oxford one too, and nobody seemed to be much bothered by this. And in fact, although I started writing on the SOAS one once or twice, it never materialized. It was only the Oxford one that did materialize.
So what was the second topic of your second PhD?
Well, it would have been much more based on material culture. I was always interested in loan vocabulary in Tulung because the Tulung speak a Tibeto-Burman language, but the lingua franca of the country is Nepali, which is Indo-European, and I was always interested in the distribution across semantic space of loan words from Nepali into Tulung. The Tulung were not really aware of this phenomenon, and one of them said, when I pointed out such a loan word, he said, "Oh, perhaps the Nepalese borrowed that from us," which was, of course, completely out of the question. But it showed how little aware or concerned they were sociolinguistically. So I had in mind to look across the whole range of material culture of the Tulung and study what parts of the house, for instance, what domestic utensils could only be referred to in Nepali and what ones had native terminology. And I think I used that idea in an analysis of weddings in Nepal among the Tulung. But there are unpublished and surely unpublishable handwritten documents somewhere at home that were intended to move towards the SOAS doctorate. But there wasn't really time, and I concentrated on mythology and ritual and the language as preliminary to the mythology for my doctoral work.
How do you remember Fürer-Haimendorf as a person?
He was, I think urbane is about the word. He had an aristocratic background. He wasn't ashamed of that. And there was a certain de haut en bas atmosphere in dealings with him, which was fair enough. You know, he was immensely experienced and knowledgeable. But I'd got from Needham and Oxford Anthropology generally a sense that theory was the really exciting thing. Theories were exciting, and straight ethnography, yeah, important to do, and you might be able to use it for theory. But Haimendorf was not really a theorist. He did write some diffusionist pieces, but really he was a descriptivist, straightforwardly, and that's fine. That's well worth being and doing, but it wasn't sort of quite what I felt a vocation to tackle.
And then you went to fieldwork to Nepal. In
what aspect?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you could just tell us a little more about your experiences.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, actually, although it wasn't part of my project, I deferred starting the project proper by 2 or 3 months in order to fit in a Himalayan expedition in 1969, the Indo-British Himalayan expedition, 1969, which I got involved with because I'd done some teaching at an outward bound school and got to know various outward bound instructors. I was a rock climbing instructor, and they invited me as medically qualified to go on this expedition to the Western Himalayas. So they organized a van, which, in spite of a crash in England, was eventually made to work and took us out as far as, I think, Chandigarh, 5 of us, and there were to be 5 Indians too. And there we met up in India under the ultimate leadership of the Indian, a man called Bahaguna, who unfortunately later died on Everest, but was a keen and good climber. He I think, hadn't had the sort of alpine background that most British climbers would acquire if they were keen, and I'd had. And I think he sort of unfortunately didn't handle the rope work well enough and died of exposure of cold. But it was a lovely experience for me, really collaborating, in a sense, with Indian colleagues. I haven't really kept up with them, though one of them tracked me down and came and had lunch in Wolfson, perhaps 10 years ago, some time ago. That was the Indian doctor, in fact, Sharma. And we did manage to climb some little pimple in the western Himalayas that hadn't been climbed before, but it was only 20,000 feet, so not a great feat. And one spends, as is normal in Himalayan climbing, far longer actually approaching the mountains than actually doing anything when you have reached them. But it was great fun, and it was the first time I met Sherpas, who brought us tea in bed, of course, in the way that happened then. I don't know, perhaps still.
Which peak was it? What's the name?
It was called Dufau Jot. There exists, I have copies of, and had donated to the Pit Rivers, a copy of the expedition report, which describes all these things in more detail than anyone would want to know. And the Pit Rivers also has the photos I took at that time. And on the trek in towards this mountain, which was in Lahul, I managed to collect some kinship terminologies which did interest me, actually, and I think I used, although it was done through interpreters and just an afternoon's work, but it was clear that the general typology of the terminology was clear even from that, and it was interesting to me. So eventually, after our expedition, which was moderately successful, one peak we did do as a Virgin Summit, one we failed on. The weather was becoming too warm, the snow too dangerous. We could have been risking avalanches, so we gave up on that second peak. But it broadened my mind about the Himalayas generally, because when doing the literary research before my Nepal fieldwork, I hadn't really moved that far west along the Himalayas. So it played its part in my becoming a Himalayanist. So then I set off for Nepal and found, as many who've done languages in this, Oriental languages in this country find, that actually for talking to real people, your background, your ability to read doesn't really help. And I spent several months during the rainy season when it wouldn't have been practical to move into a peasant village because people would have been too busy. I spent several months really concentrating on trying to communicate in Nepali, mostly in Okhaldunga, which is by Nepal standards, big-ish market town in the east of the country, meeting various people, not only Nepalese, but also sort of Peace Corps volunteers, and one person who worked at the mission hospital there, with whom I discussed existentialism, I think. So that was quite a pleasant 2 or 3 months. Then I moved to a Sherpa town. I forget exactly why. it was on the main trekking route from Kathmandu to Okhladunga, maybe that was why, and spent perhaps 10 days there. And then I moved to essentially a Tulung market settlement called Nele Bazar. And there I taught a little bit in the school, trying to use my Nepali, teaching them, trying to teach the unfortunates English. I remember the wretched textbook they used had extracts from English poetry in it, completely unsuitable because daffodils in the Lake District are really not what they needed. And it had the Pied Piper of Hamelin and talked about how the rats piped in or how the Pied Piper piped in 1,000 sharps and flats. And the footnote said flats, apartments, which I tried to correct that misapprehension, but thousands of, no doubt, puzzled school children across Nepal were being misled. And then finally, after 5 months, maybe 4 or 5 months, in November, I think, I moved into Mukli, where I settled in with various help of various people, found a landlord whose son was away in the army and who was willing, therefore, to lend me his room, his upper floor room, which was vacant, rent, which was very reasonable. And at first I had a cook boy, but he was such a nuisance to the landlord that he didn't last very long, and I was invited to share meals with the family, which was splendid because it exposed me more to local life. For a long time I was struggling with Tulung. By this time I was fluent enough in Nepali to say what I wanted to and ask questions. But I wanted to work on Tulung heritage. I was supposed to study social change, and I understood that as meaning to study relationship between the incoming Nepali-speaking culture and the local indigenous Tulung culture, which was one interpretation of what you meant by social change, but I wasn't really interested in things like coming of the primary school, coming of the markets, those sorts of things. I was really interested in the salvage ethnography aspect of the Tulung. And I hadn't really got the background in straight linguistics that would have been really helpful. But luckily I had read a little, and so I did begin collecting minimal pairs fairly quickly to work out a transcription. And at least I was on the right tracks, but it was quite hard to get useful stuff to transcribe for several reasons. I mean, one, the teachers I had, and I usually used local school teachers who were accustomed to dealing with stupid people who didn't understand and ask masses of questions. And I found them, eventually I found a very good assistant. Partly they found it a bit unnatural to just sit in front of a tape recorder and speak. I got one too to give me, for instance, an agricultural calendar, an account of his life, that sort of thing. But it didn't seem very natural, and they didn't much enjoy that. Getting sort of real Tulung material turned out to be not terribly easy for two reasons. One, the rituals are usually conducted in a form of the language which is totally different from ordinary Tulung. And I wrote about this eventually, Tulung ritual language. You can recognize some of the vocabulary, but most of it is intended to be addressed to the spirit world. It's not intended to address ordinary mortals. So although I could record masses of this stuff, and I have got masses of it recorded, and I transcribed it, it wasn't very hard, it wasn't very easy to get people to expound it, explain what the words meant and what the chants were aiming at. So that was one problem. And it turned out eventually that there was quite a lot of Tulung mythology, but it was not easy to get people to tell it. They usually said, "Oh, I don't know it. The people who used to know it, they've all died, I'm afraid." And if they did say it, they used to do it, if they did tell it, they used to do it very apologetically and sort of say, "Well, I don't really know, but I think I heard something like this." And in fact, it turned out that the Tulung mythology had survived quite reasonably well, and I could get it if I asked specific questions, not just tell me about your Sanskriti, your culture, your traditions. But I've heard that there was a king called Ramli who reigned here in Mukli. Could you tell me a bit more about him? And if you ask specific questions, you are more likely to get an answer. So eventually I began accumulating quite a lot, but much more of this was in my second spell, because after the first year, I went back to Kathmandu to meet my more or less fiancée and bring her out to the village. And it was in the course of that trip that I got a lot of help from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, in the sense that they gave me lots of preprints of how they had worked out how to transcribe Tibeto-Burman languages. And I realized that I hadn't been nearly rigorous enough in my collection of minimal pairs, and that I'd failed to distinguish long and short vowels. So the first year had sort of got me started, but I couldn't properly even transcribe the language until after that. My wife, current wife, was only with me for perhaps 4 weeks, I think, and then she went back to England.
How did she like the trip?
Well, she'd made the mistake of, she'd followed me, and I think followed is the word, because she turned down an offer to work with voluntary service overseas in Africa. She said, "No, I want to go to India," and in fact they sent her to Pakistan. And so she, in a way, followed me eastwards, and had a year teaching there. And she got someone to make her some climbing boots, but they were too tight. And she wore them for the first days walking from Kathmandu and got terrible blisters, whereafter she did all the trek in ordinary flip-flops to keep her heels, to give her heels a chance to recover. When we got to Mukli, my landlord's wife said, "Have the mice been eating your heels?" And we turned down, that was a mistake probably, we turned down the offer to fund a shaman to come and cure the heels. Anyway, they turned out, they cured themselves eventually. Yeah, she enjoyed it a lot, I think. Yeah.
And you yourself also had a reputation as a doctor during your field?
No, as I said earlier, I didn't have much of a reputation as a doctor. You didn't really cultivate it. I didn't sort of refuse to take an interest if people came to me, but they didn't come very often, and they soon realized that I wasn't really there for that. That's another aspect of doing field work, explaining to the native people what on earth you're there for, why are you there? A lot of them, having military backgrounds, thought, oh, he's here to as a spy for the army, which was certainly not true, and nobody ever sort of asked me military questions later on. Although I knew a certain amount about Himalayan borders, I was never picked up on that. So I used to explain that at primary school your children are learning geography, bhugol, and in England people know about the Gurkhas and they want to know about where they come from. So I'm trying to learn about your history and culture. Culture being Sanskriti, that being the only word, I think. So some people accepted this, others didn't. It treated me as a bit of a mystery. I think my landlord did actually understand what I was about and was extremely helpful and dictated quite a lot of stuff for me, for instance, about marriage rituals.
And then in 1971 you returned to England?
Yes. Yes,
position in
back to England and my wife. We got married fairly soon after that.
Mm-hmm.
And back to Lineker. I found it quite difficult to write. I had a sort of writer's block and would sometimes, I think I spent a whole day looking at a blank sheet of paper and not knowing where to start. So much had happened. I knew so much. What do you say first? What do you say second? I should have been much more rigorous, and I should have had some advice. First thing to do is index your notes. And while doing that, you'll probably get some ideas what you want to say first. But I was very slow to do that, and my indexing was never very good. But I could, of course, rely a good deal at that time on memory, which subsequently, of course, I couldn't. So I produced a few articles, but I didn't get very far with the thesis, partly because I felt that I had to do an account of the language before producing a thesis on mythology. I mean, if it's an unknown, unwritten language, if you just say, I'm writing about the mythology in this language, people could well ask, well, how do we know you've not invented it? And I felt the need, and I did do this, to write a grammar of Tulung and lexicon, a grammar and lexicon, explaining my knowledge of the language, such as it was. And I did do that before finalizing the thesis, which contained a large appendix of texts in Tulung transcribed after, on the basis of the phonemic analysis of the language. Yes, so I was rather a slow writer-up and must have been a bit disappointing, I suspect. But I had money enough, just about, especially with my wife's help, to survive. The grant had now come to an end, to survive for a year, but I had to seriously look for a job. And I think the second or third interview, I decided not to go for a job at Aberdeen as being just too far away. I did go for one in Newcastle, didn't get it, and the third one I think was Durham, which I did get, and I did most of my writing up, in effect, there, helped considerably by having to teach, which forces you to meet deadlines, and I think is a very good exercise for anyone writing a thesis in anthropology. Gives you a sense of what you're trying to do that you may well lack otherwise.
What were your experiences of teaching at Durham?
First, really being lost. I hadn't done any teaching, really. In those days, one wasn't offered the opportunity, and I really didn't know how to begin. I had that same sort of blank feeling. Got to produce an essay on, got to produce a lecture on social change. Where do I start? And I remember spending 1 or 2 nights when I didn't go to sleep. I was just trying to write for the next day. But luckily that phase passed within a couple of months, probably. But I always found I tended at that time to write my lectures out more or less in full by hand, and I found lecturing quite difficult. Tutorial teaching was more fun, and I enjoyed devising tutorials for little groups of 5. We didn't have solo tutorials for the undergraduates at all then. I remember particularly being interested in a tutorial I did on devised on the symbolism of the center. Now, how center and cardinal points, mandalas, buildings with spires, nave and transepts, all the extraordinarily pervasive sense you get in the Orient that center and cardinal points is really basic to thinking about totalities. I think that was played a part in my later writings. I remember particularly enjoying setting up for the first time a course in anthropology and language, which I think has continued, and I think it's still going strong in Dublin. What else? Well, we began our family at that time, and that, of course, was so our domestic life was nice. Lots of trips to the countryside, a little bit of climbing still on the close to the Roman wall. And I still went on 1 or 2 more alpine holidays, leaving my family. But that was beginning to tail off. I was still playing squash quite a bit. But colleague-wise, I don't think I gained very much from the fellow teachers. More from the books I was reading. I was reading quite a lot of Tibetology at that time because I did a region course in Himalayan ethnography, and that included some Tibetology.
Did you keep in touch with other Tibetologists by course?
Yes, yes, and went during that time to various conferences involving, I think that's right. Yeah, there was surely 1 or 2 in France with the French Tibetologists, and yes. But I can't, just as I find it terribly difficult to put students into years, so to put conferences into years, even roughly, is difficult. I can remember conferences that were useful to me, but often they're completely vague as to when.
Then in 1976, you returned to Oxford.
Yes, I remember wondering whether it would be a good idea or not, because I was happy there, and the family was happy there, and I was worried about the transition from student to teacher and colleague, and in particular about my relationship with Professor Needham, who, although I got on with him quite well, I came to feel, especially when I was teaching in Durham, that a lot of his views were either misleading or straight wrong, and I could foresee problems in relating to him if I was to teach what I really thought, and if one really has to maintain that degree of integrity. So it wasn't obvious that I ought to move, but then my father died, my mother left a widow, so it seemed sensible to be moved near them. And of course, Oxford has all sorts of other attractions which I was not blind to.
Did you also finish your DPhil at the time? Do you have a viva?
Yes, it was during the vacation. I had the viva during the vacation before moving to Oxford in April or May. So I went right up to the absolute limit that I was allowed, and was working quite fast at the end. But that happens to many people, I think, that you speed up as the writing progresses and you have a clearer sense of purpose and limits and so on.
Who were your examiners?
Yes, they were, I think on all occasions, that is for the B.Lit as well, Fürer-Haimendorf and Godfrey Leonhardt. I think that's right. But it may have been someone else for the B.Lit, I can't now remember. Yes, Fürer-Haimendorf actually did pick up one mistake, which was good. But there weren't many corrections to be made. And about this time, our second daughter was born. We were living at the Institute flat at the top of 61, which the Institute still possesses. Before we, within 3 or 4 months, I think, bought a house in Southmore Road where we've remained ever since.
And, who were the people at Oxford who might have been influential for you and for your work? So Michael Aris was probably just coming.
He was probably just coming, yes. Yes.
You also took part in the first IATS, the International Association for Tibetan Studies conference in 1979.
Yes. I hadn't sort of fully realized what my job would involve, and I continued for a few years to regard myself as a Himalayanist rather than a South Asianist. But this became harder and harder to maintain. I mean, obviously I could have a regional specialization within India, in the Himalayas. That's not a problem. But I just found myself supervising much more widely than the Himalayas, and I just had to know much more about India in general, on the whole, Hinduism, than I had in the past. So there was a sort of rather awkward period when I tried to keep up being a Himalayanist and teaching South Asia generally. And that gradually resolved itself during the 80s as I became aware of having general anthropological theories both about South Asia and about anthropology. So the Himalayas sort of gradually faded from my awareness, and I don't nowadays read much Himalayan material, very little in fact.
And could you tell us more about your involvement in the Himalayas and Tibet in the 70s, where you meeting Michael Aris or studying?
Yes, of course, yes. I was delighted when Michael settled in Oxford, and I think I got to know him fairly early on. I think at that time he was at St. John's, but he did later have at least membership of common room at Wolf's, and I can't remember the exact category or the date. And I used to go to his classes in Tibetan when he began setting them up. They were not, I think, ever officially on the lecture list because the Oriental Institute wasn't set up for that sort of thing. But there were quite a few of us who went to these classes. I don't know, maybe sort of 6 or so. I can't remember very much about them, though I obviously learnt the script, which I'd probably learnt before that. Must have learnt before that because I used Tibetan dictionaries when writing my thesis. But he taught us much more about reading the language. We used to meet, I think, mostly in his house in Parktown, or his flat in Parktown, rather than on university premises. And he'd set us homework and we'd try and struggle with it. Most of the people doing it, I think, already knew more than I did. I suspect there were people like Michael, I think, Broido, who, although paid to be a mathematician at Magdalen, in fact, really was seriously interested in Tibetan. And who else was there? I can't be sure now. I think an Attenborough, one of the Attenboroughs was there. Anyway, it was nice really to be in touch with real Tibetologists frequently, and I enjoyed that. But my knowledge of Tibetan was never taken very far, and has declined even further since.
How did the classes look like? Which texts did you read? Or did you talk?
Yes. I was trying to remember this, but I can't. And I looked at home to see if I'd got any old Xeroxes. I suspect he gave us Xeroxes. But what they were of, I don't know. I have a vague feeling that we used a German textbook by a man called Hahn. Is that likely? Yes. I think there weren't many textbooks, and I don't know what he'd used or what was used for teaching by Denwood at SOAS. Denwood was the SOAS teacher at that time. I really can't remember much about that, which is disappointing. It was nice, of course, also to meet Sue, who struck me as a lady of considerable determination. That was the characteristic I retained of her. This woman is really seriously determined in whatever she does, and I think sometimes that means that she's perhaps a little less flexible than is incumbent on or useful to a politician. But I don't know whether that's perhaps a superficial judgment. But anyway, we knew them socially, and they'd come to dinner, and my wife still recalls that she had some derogatory comment about some vegetables Sheila had cooked.
How do you remember Michael Aris as a person?
Oh, Michael was very friendly, warm. I mean, he was a splendid chap all round, really. Full of joie de vivre, really. He enjoyed what he did, and he did it with enthusiasm, and had a lot of interesting experience to build on, and was really looking forward to expanding Tibetan studies. He sort of gradually saw that Oxford ought to have such an expansion, and He, I think, must from an early stage have been aware that money would be needed, and began working on that. But he'd always mixed in fairly high-level society, if I can put it like that. The Gore Booths, who'd been ambassadors, people like that he knew. He tended to know big men, as you might say, to use the New Guinea expression. He circulated in those circles, and I didn't know much about that side of his life, really. Yes, I mean, he obviously was also in touch with the French Tibetologists, but I can't say much about that. Did he read French fluently? He could well have, but I just don't remember.
And what about the IATS in 1979? You participated yourself?
Yes, I think I was... Yes, I wrote some sort of précis, didn't I, on Tulung mythology and how it related to Tibetan and other Himalayan mythology. Yes, and met, I mean, it was nice to do so, met lots of Tibetologists. And, of course, regretted that I hadn't got further with the language, but you can't do everything in life. I'm afraid I'm again a bit disappointed in my memories. I mean, not that the conference was disappointed, but that my memory of it is disappointing. I simply don't remember very much. A few faces. I can't even remember where it was held in St. John's. You know, I can't place it physically.
I think MacDonald came from France.
He would have come, surely, yes. Not, I think, his wife. I think they'd split up by that time.
And Richardson was here. Location.
Yes. His photograph. Looking for photographs, I took that volume from my shelves, and here's there, a rather fine photograph of someone who looks very Raj-like, doesn't he, with his medals and things. But that was life in those days. Yes, I must have read all those articles in my time, but I'm afraid a lot of that will have faded.
Also, Charles Remble, as a student, took part.
Ah, Charles, yes.
Would you remember?
Well, he was super right from the start. I mean, from a supervisor's point of view, a good student just is no trouble. They're exposed to good libraries, they go and read up, they're exposed to the possibility of fieldwork, they do it, they come back and they write it up and they show you polished chapters. And Charles was really like that, you know, he just did it all. I don't know if I had influence on him. It was probably just general encouragement, but also an awareness of European scholarship. I sort of rather took it for granted that he would have to acquire good French in order to use the French Tibetologists, and ought to acquire enough German to use the German Indologists too. So maybe all that sort of interaction with continental Tibetologists helped him to sort of orient himself in the discipline. And of course he later married a French girl, but I think he wasn't at that time married to Anne de Salle. I can't remember the exact dates, but I think he was married to someone else for quite a while.
Talking about students, did you have other students who you would view as your succeeders?
There are a sort of fringe of people who weren't supervised by me for a doctorate. And I'm thinking here perhaps of David Gellner, who came to me for some Himalayan classes. I forget what exactly the context was, but I think we did 4 sort of group tutorials. I think at that time there were several other Himalayanists around, and he might remember more than me about them. I think Martin Gensler was around, who worked on the Rai too, and whom I saw in Vienna not long ago, 2 years ago. David Gellner was, of course, supervised by Richard Gombrich, not myself, but he had the same philological feel because he had to study Newari as well as Nepali, and so I always felt sort of close to his approach. Theoretically, I always felt he was perhaps a little too Weberian and not sufficiently Durkheimian, but that's a small issue. He was the chap that I really wanted as my successor, and when I began thinking about retiring fairly early, I went to ask him whether he'd apply for the job, because I really wanted him to be the successor. And he said he would. And although he didn't actually end up with my job because he got the Lever Hume Research Fellowship at the same time, and so was doing that, and rather than actually teaching the South Asia option. And that option, I think, wasn't taught for a while. So he was a sort of marginal student. There were others. Monica Connell lived with the Magar, I think, one of the branches, one of the groups of the Magar, and wrote a popular book. I don't know how well it sold. She didn't complete her thesis, which was disappointing because she obviously knew the society well and was happy with the Magar. Her book's okay, but as a Himalayanist, one finds it it's addressed to the wider public rather than specialists. Other students. Oh yes, there was the one who studied the Yakka and now teaches at Durham. Oh dear, the name is slipping me for the moment. May come back to me. He wrote his thesis on the Yakka. That was okay. And I've kept up with him. He's someone I write to at Christmas with a Christmas card. But I didn't have... Oh, Graham Clark. Yes, there were several of them. Now you asked me about it. Graham Clark did a thesis on a Sherpa Valley north of the Central Valley, but was never quite never quite made his way into academic life. He got some, he did some jobs and did a bit of teaching here and there, but died very sadly very young. Were there others? There may have been, but I can't remember many of them. Those seem to be the main Nepali ones, and I also had, of course, many students elsewhere. Later on, Peter Sutherland was a Himalayanist, yes, but he was not Nepal. He wrote a good and valuable thesis on, I think it was in Teri Garhwal, just on the borders between Himachal and Uttar Pradesh, or whatever it changed its name to. Anyway, Terigawal. That was a good thesis which related to my second fieldwork more closely than anything else did, really. He ended up teaching in Louisiana, using his and publishing occasionally on his Himalayan work, but not nearly as much as he ought to have, I think. Perhaps, no, I don't know why he didn't, but he's still in anthropology there.
Were there still some other scholars with whom you interacted at the time? Or maybe...
Well, I've just thought of another. You wouldn't quite call her a Himalayanist, or you might, depending on your definition. Vibha Joshi, of course, worked on the Nagas, and she was quite a long time as a student, and her English gave me quite a lot of problems over the weekends. But she did a perfectly good thesis and has taught a lot in Germany and used it. She's, of course, married to David Parkin now, and they have a child. And there were other people who worked on... Oh, of course, I'd forgotten who's the one at Brooks? Is a not McFarlane, not MacDonald, McDougall, but anyway, the chap who worked on the Taru, who did interesting work, and again hasn't published quite as much as one would hope, but he's done good work and maintained his position at Brooks University. So there are slightly more than first came to mind.
Did you meet some of the Tibetan lamas or scholars passing through Oxford in the 60s and 70s?
I didn't actually have very close relations with any of them. I don't know quite why not. I think partly because I felt ashamed at not having pushed my Tibetan further. I just felt I was so amateurish at Tibetan and so marginal to actually knowing much about Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, I'd read a lot of the old books, but I didn't know very much and couldn't read Tibetan texts as such. So, I mean, in a way, the Buddhist the Buddhist cleric, well, what's the word? The Buddhist nun I knew best was in Kinnar in my second fieldwork. She was the sister of the village headman in Bury in the 1980s, early 80s, 81, 83. She was a very dynamic and impressive lady who had married downstream on the Sutlej from somewhere where Buddhism flourished and determined that Bury village should have a monastery, and she got it built, a whole gumpa, and I've still got a photo of her carrying stones to build the monastery. Splendid person. And we used to walk for sort of peace of mind around that monastery. And that was when I felt closest to Buddhism. I think when I was a Himalayanist, I obviously felt torn between the Tulung indigenous and similar tribes, as we used to call them, along the Himalayas, torn between the indigenous Tibeto-Burmans, the Tibetans in the north, the Hindus from the west and south. So I had, in a way, to handle three cultures, and it's the Tibetan one that I was least at ease with, and the Tulung I was most interested in. But then gradually Hinduism began to dominate my thinking. And I would like to think that it will dominate my future reputation, such as it may be, that some of my work on Indo-European comparativism bears on the history of Hinduism, and maybe that's the most significant thing I've done.
So, before that, could you tell us a bit more about your fieldwork in Himachal Pradesh in the early 80s?
Yes. I wanted to go to the northeast because I knew from Verya Elwin and people like that there would be lots of Tibeto-Burman mythology, bags of it, in, say, Arunachal. But I was disappointed that the political situation, difficulty of getting visas and so on, meant that the northeast just wasn't feasible to plan on visiting, take one's family and so on. It was just not going to work out. So although I began reading quite a lot about the northeast, I had to look for other areas of the Himalayas. I didn't want to go back to Nepal because there's a slight feeling, which David Gellner sometimes complains about, that Nepal specialists aren't really South Asianists, they're something different. And since I was hired to teach South Asia, social anthropology of South Asia, I felt that it would be desirable to work in India, so I didn't think of trying elsewhere in Nepal. I looked further to the west and remembered Lahul, but in fact decided eventually on the Kinari area north of Simla. And didn't do a great deal of preparation. I mean, whereas I'd written a whole thesis on Nepal before I went there, a whole B.Lit, I hadn't written or even read a great deal about the Western Himalayas as far west as that. I'd read a few books on Ladakh, I suppose. But Kinnar seemed to me attractive because they'd got this Tibeto-Burman language quite well established. Some people thought it related to Zhangzhung, an issue I think that's never been totally sorted out. I don't know what the current views may be on that. But I thought if I'm going to do the same sort of field work, working on language and myth, that would be the place to do it. And there were several reasons. Well, let's not come to the sad business of why it didn't get really written up and why it wasn't a perfect success. It was a lovely place to be, really beautiful as the place I'd lived in Nepal, with forested hills, with the snow melting on the high pastures when we arrived, masses of tree blossoms. It's a lovely place to be, especially with two young children. One was 3, the other 5 or 6 when we first went, and my wife. It was a great experience for the family. I sort of felt now I've done one Tibeto-Burman tribal group, I can do another quickly, I know what I want. So I settled down onto the language quite quickly. I hadn't found Hindi too much of a trial. I'd done quite a bit of that and improved such Hindi as I had when I was trying to get permits in Delhi. I spent a very frustrating time trying to get a permit to work in Upper Kinnar, fairly close to the Tibetan border. So I did in a way some field work among Indian bureaucracy, including getting bribed. So I feel I've using bribes, not getting bribed, using bribes, but it still didn't work. And I met the Raja of Kinnar, and various people, friends of Mrs. Gandhi. I kept sort of trying to move in suitable society to wangle some sort of permit, but it didn't work out. And when I went to Kinnar, I discovered that the inner line, which was the border in question, had moved, and that people in Delhi weren't aware of this or didn't tell me, and that I could study Kinnari this side of the inner line without going right into beyond Wangtu Bridge into Upper Kinnar. So quickly I decided that was the thing to do, and I think it was probably just as, I mean, it was obviously the right thing to do in terms of using my time, but probably I wouldn't have done better if I had gone further north, if I had been able to go beyond Wangtu Bridge. I did once visit the Great Wangtu Bridge, which was the site of the inner line, and was promptly arrested for an hour or two. What are you doing so close to the inner line? But they let me go when they realized I wasn't settling, I wasn't serious. So I tried to get on top of Kinnari language, working again with educated informants, I mean, either people who were school teachers or had had a fair amount of education, younger people, because if you're working with a 60, 70-year-old person, you can't cross-question them. What do you mean exactly? Is that right? Somebody said something different, and they like to do things gradually and put it their way across. So I had to work with younger people. That was okay. They spoke the language, but turned out to be a jolly difficult language, and I realized after the 10 months there that I hadn't got on top of it. I didn't know how to write it properly. I also realized that although I had a good deal of general knowledge of the culture, material culture, what it's like going up to the high pastures, the agriculture, all these sort of things, general knowledge, the actual mythology that I wanted wasn't Tibeto-Burman. Any myths I could get were always bits of Purana-style myth. And I think that probably would have been the case even if I had crossed the Wangtu Bridge, but I don't know. I haven't followed the literature on Kinnar now that the inner line has moved further north. It was, as I say, a great experience, and was useful to me for supervising Peter Sutherland, and for interacting with one or two French people who were interested in that area. One of them came to stay in our house for a few days, but it was too difficult really to carry on and bring my knowledge of the language to a satisfactory level. There were tones, there were difficulties in the vowel structure. I just didn't know how to write it. And by 83, when I had a summer vac from Oxford, which I spent there, I desperately tried to get further with the language, but didn't really crack it. And I'd never had any training in phonetics. I'd somehow managed to get by in Tulung, but ridiculous in a way not to have trained myself. But anyway, there it was. So after 83, I kept thinking I'll write something substantial about Kinnar, even if it means that I can't spell the words properly. But by this time, I was beginning to have other ideas. I was beginning to have ideas about kinship, a macro kinship theory, which I think outdid Levi-Strauss in certain respects. And I was ambitious to take that further, which I did in the 80s. I was just beginning to see what more could be made of Mose and Mose's ideas, and of primitive classification in particular. And that was a sort of horizon that was beckoning me already by 84. And I think I'd already, again, rather similarly, just got a glimpse of what I might try and do in the Indo-European domain to revise Dumont. I say Dumont was very much in my mind. If I'm going to teach South Asia, I'm going to teach Dumont, okay. But Dumont's whole approach was based on the opposition between hierarchy in India and egalitarianism, homo equalis in the West. And one has to unpack those terms. They're not straightforward, but that was how he basically thought of the relationship between India and Europe. And it seems to me only one possibility. Sure, you can contrast the two, but can you not also do interesting things by looking at their common roots, the Indo-European heritage? And I think I was already in 83 for just beginning to glimpse the possibilities of developing that line of thought, which is the one that really enthuses me most at the moment.
Yeah, we will come to that, but before your contemporary and future work, could you tell us something about the establishment of the Tibetan and Himalayan Studies here in the year 2000?
Ah, right. Well, do you know what year Michael died?
1999.
Oh, was it? Yes, yes. Well, before he died, so later 90s, we were already planning something like what became established. I can't remember how soon it started, maybe in mid-90s. And Michael felt that money would be findable. He always had that confidence. And we had various meetings to discuss the possibility of developing Tibetan studies in Oxford. I remember them taking place in that upper room at the Pitt River, at the Oriental Institute. And there was somebody called, I think, Olison, who was sort of good at administration. I forget what he was, maybe an Arabist or something, or a sinologist. But he was chairman, and I think I didn't contribute very much. I went to these sort of meetings, but not being much good at or very strong on sort of administration, how you set up a course. This was foreign territory to me, except insofar as I'd set up one in Durham, but that was long ago, and Oxford's going to be far more difficult to change anything, to organise things. There are so many interests involved. So I don't think I contributed very much, but I did dutifully turn up to all such meetings that I was invited to. Maybe some I think were held in St. Anthony's, and there were, I think the master of St. Anthony's was, whatever they call him, was active in promoting the idea. So that's about all I actually remember about the process of setting it up. These talks. It's just possible that if I look through old filing cabinets and things, I can find a few papers, but you may have papers about that. They're probably not different.
So, would you remember who was involved in these discussions, or how many people were? Perhaps Anthony Aris?
Yes, it was Anthony. I don't think he was. I felt I didn't... I met him at the odd conference, but I don't think I met him in that sort of administrative context. I feel I may have met him in St. Anthony's. Perhaps we held some of the meetings there, but I don't remember him as a participant. I would imagine Richard Gombrich would have been there, certainly worth asking him. No, I don't remember. You see, administration is something I tend to get through and feel, good, that's out of the way. Now I can get on to my real work. So I didn't really concentrate very much on those things. Other people seemed to know how you did these things, and they got on with it.
And would you remember if Michael Aris had a certain idea how the program should look like?
Yes, he must have had a lot of ideas about it. I suppose he would have envisaged himself as the first holder of the lecturership. He'd have been perfectly well suited. I suppose he was sort of vaguely hoping that he would make his way as an Oxbridge academic in that way. But I can't even affirm that that was definitely in his mind. I suppose it would have been. Because I can't remember when Sue had moved back to Burma, for instance. Was she back in at that time? In which case he might have thought, well, maybe I don't want or need to be based in Oxford. I might manage to do some useful work in Burma still. I really can't remember that sort of consideration at all. Or the other people who were involved. I feel that from Wolfson, some of the Orientalists were very supportive. Maybe Jeremy Johns was supportive, the man who eventually became director of that Museum of Islamic Art. I think it was he. Gosh, this is a really difficult question, though. I really don't remember. Nor do I remember when exactly Ulrika first came. She came as a JRF, I think. And I can't remember where she was based. Where was she? She may have been at Wolfson. Probably was at Wolfson, yes. But how that related to anything, I think she was probably too young to be relevant at that time. Was Per Werner involved?
Yes.
He could have been, yes.
A little bit.
Yes. He seems likely to have been at such meetings. He's always been a sort of faithful, involved member of the sort of Oxford Tibetology world. Yes. I don't think we had any of the French people, but maybe somebody else. Are you going to interview Per? He might remember.
Yeah, we have interviewed him.
You have?
Yeah, but he said he came only twice.
Oh, yes.
He wasn't really instrumental.
No.
And he recommended to interview Richard Gombrich.
Yes, who was instrumental. Yeah, well, Richard, as you know, is a man of great determination, confidence and drive, so he may well have been important. I don't remember that.
Were you involved in the process of choosing Charles Ramble to be the first lecturer?
No, I don't think I was. I may have written a reference. I can't even remember that now. But, I mean, I obviously thought he'd be an excellent person. I was a little pessimistic whether he was sufficiently philological. But my doubts were ill-founded. I mean, actually, he was sufficiently philological, and I think he's perfectly good on that side, and that was recognised. But I was a little pessimistic that he'd be, too anthropological for people like Alexis Sanderson. But I was quite wrong, and delighted, of course, when he got it.
And then we can move to your contemporary and future work.
Well, I always say that the future is still more important to me than the past. I hang on to that hope. Right. Well, I don't expect to write anything more on... Oh, I do, that's the trouble. Sometimes people will ask you for sort of follow-up papers on... one on kinship and one on Durkheim, and I've got two of those pending. I haven't got deadlines, but I've promised to produce something on both of those. On the kinship, I'd be quite interested to try and explain why Godelier, who's a big man, a big name in kinship studies, got tetradic theory wrong. I mean, he didn't really see the point of it, and he ought to have, and I think I can sort of set him right. He's an old friend, so he won't mind. And I was asked by another old friend, Roger Woodard, at Michigan, to do this thing on Durkheim and myth. And so I feel I am obliged to do it, though it's not a very obvious topic. Anyway, apart from that, I've got masses of ideas for what I want to do in the Indo-European field. At the moment, I'm reviewing a real doorstopper of a book that won't, I fear, be widely read, but is absolutely mainstream to what Indo-European comparativism can be and should be. It's an 819-page in Italian volume with... which covers a lot of stuff from nearly all branches of Indo-European by a curious non-academic. He has been an academic, an Italian. He has obviously studied Indo-European philology and linguistics, and has taught for a bit here and there, but he's managed to acquire what must be a sinecure for the Italian government working in Switzerland, and he's writing a lot of stuff. In not this 819-page book was preceded 2 years previously by one that was certainly in the 700s, and he's seriously learned, and he's got a lot of interesting ideas. So I feel that at least a review article on this, since I can handle Italian, is something I ought to do to sort of help the field advance. And that's interrupting the work that I was doing, which is a comparison between the Mahabharata and the Sri Lankan chronicle, the Mahavamsa. Although the Mahavamsa was written down only about 500, so it's relatively late, it's astonishingly similar to the Mahabharata in many ways, and there are questions to be asked about why it is so similar, but the first thing to do is to establishing the surprisingly fact that they are similar, that certain characters in the one correspond to certain characters in the other. Often you get, as one does in comparative work, you get two characters who have been run together into a single character. Two characters in one of your comparanda run together to be a single character in your other comparandum. But I was perhaps 2/3 of the way through a book on that when I got interrupted by this Italian work. And when I've done that, I've got not just an idea, but quite substantial notes on a book that must be written on comparisons between the Mahabharata and Geoffrey of Monmouth, Floruit, England, in 1130. And some of the Mahabharata stories are astonishingly similar to those in Geoffrey of Monmouth. And that book I really want to write. Meanwhile, I'm caught up with the fact that I've been under pressure for years from colleagues in anthropology to publish a collection of my papers, and I put together a project to do this with 25 papers, 24, I can't remember, and got some money and have got a research assistant, in principle, helping me combine them to make a worthwhile book. But I haven't yet got a publisher, and so that's slightly hanging fire at the moment. Publishers don't like, I'm told, volumes of papers that have already been published, even if several of them have been published in French or in book form, in books that are not easily obtainable, or in journals that have since become defunct. Even so, they don't really like that sort of book, because librarians say that it'll all be accessible on the internet somewhere. But so I have to argue, or people supporting me have to argue, that you get more from a book that will bring together these articles, one of which is unpublished, than you would get from struggling with difficulty to find as many as you can online. So that's sort of ongoing, and the big the review article of the Italian book is ongoing, and the stuff in Pali, which I've had to learn, of course, fairly recently, would be ongoing, and I hope will be sometime again in the summer. So there's a lot, and this isn't the lot. I've got a paper which I wrote in 2010 on the Republic, Plato's Republic, and how Indo-European it is. And this was to appear in a collective volume. And the editor of that collective volume accepted my paper, and still in 2018 is not planning to send in the other papers or the full thing until the summer. And I've been pushing him year after year to get this thing out, and he hasn't. So eventually I've withdrawn it from that publication and thinking where to send it, and I'm taking advice on. The trouble is, classicists, many of whom will have given their lives to Plato, are not going to welcome being told that they won't understand the roots of his thinking if they don't know anything about Indo-European comparison. But then that's one of my general problems, that classicists and Indologists too, but there are so many more classicists, they're so much more powerful. On the whole, don't like having their frame of reference disturbed. If you've done a doctorate in classics, you know what the subject is, you know who are the big names in it, and you know from general knowledge what names occasionally to drop in, like a bit of Derrida or something. Okay, you're not absolutely bound by the borders of classics as taught and as examined, but in practice they don't really want to read stuff saying, go and read the Mahabharata. And so that's one of the problems I face, and other comparativists, so that in a sense we tend to function as a pseudo-discipline on our own. I say pseudo because it's not institutionalized. Indo-European philology is well institutionalized. There are recognized journals, there are recognized courses, you can get qualifications in it. But Indo-European cultural comparativism isn't like that, and it's quite hard to get doctorates in it, and so people are always brought up in different disciplines, because the Indo-European philologists are not at ease outside mere language. Language is marvellous and interesting, but they'll move on to poetic language, just some of them, the bold ones, and there's a lot on Indo-Germanische Dichtersprache, but they won't move on the whole, to Indo-European culture or comparison, i.e. narratives. And that's what they need in order to appreciate Dumézil and work on Indo-European ideology, and hence the ultimate roots of the thought that lies behind Plato. And there are other things I could talk about. I'd love to write about the Shahnameh, but my Persian isn't good enough, and probably I'll never get round to that, though I have just recently had an article comparing a bit of Sufi hagiography, which I don't know in the original, but has been translated, and it's quite clear that part of it relates to part of the Mahabharata, so that's only just come out in the last few weeks. But there's a lot of stuff that I'm excited about for the future.
Good luck. And Nick, we have two more questions. So one is, what do you think your career in anthropology has given you personally? How it has changed or enriched your life?
Oh, well, it's been a marvellous subject. I mean, for an academic child who likes ideas, likes languages, likes travel, it gave me everything I wanted. And, of course, not to be despised is contact with bright young minds. I mean, this too is something that one can really enjoy and is really lucky to have. After all, suppose I'd gone into business, you might meet bright young minds, but it wouldn't be the same somehow. The desire to make money just wouldn't inspire me in the same way as desire to discover, to think new thoughts. So yeah, it's been a marvellous environment. I had my difficulties when I first moved to Oxford. There were problems with the department, with Professor Needham particularly, but they passed, and I've since been very happy in the department. So what's it given me? Well, it's given me everything really, except family, and family has been a great component of life, obviously, too. It's sort of interacted with anthropology in various ways. I think it's probably no accident that both my daughters have ended up marrying non-Brits. One married a Spaniard, lives in Gran Canaria. One married an Algerian refugee whom she met in a refugee camp here. And so the sort of openness and breadth that anthropology tries to give and convey may have, in that sort of way, fed into my family life as well as dominating my academic life.
And as we are conducting this project for future generations of researchers and students, what would be your message for them or advice?
Well, I think one important thing is to take a long-term view of things so far as it's possible. As I sometimes say, I started learning Sanskrit 15 years before I actually wrote any papers that used it. And now, more or less every paper I write uses it. So, if possible, don't be shut in too much or exclusively by these sort of 5-year horizon that scientists have inflicted on arts people whose horizons are longer. We work for a longer time scale. So don't be afraid of tackling new things, and try and manufacture a situation in which you can give yourself time to invest in the longish term future. But of course it's hard, I know, for young people whose jobs are often not looked at by their employers in quite that way. But try and manipulate things so that they can be managed in that way with long-term and ambitious goals.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting.
Okay.
Thank you, Nick.